Hi, my name is Elaine Roddy, and I'm a vegetable crop specialist with the Ministry of Agriculture, Food, and Rural Affairs in Ridgetown. This is the introduction to the Cucurbit Integrated Pest Management Workshop. The workshop will consist of 4 different modules in which I discuss the 3 main groups of diseases, and then I will also discuss the main insects that impact cucurbit crops in Ontario. Cucurbits are a diverse group of crops, many of which are grown commercially here in Ontario. So they include the pumpkins, squash, gourds, zucchini, pickles, cantaloupe, watermelon. Those are the most common of the crops grown in Ontario. Over the course of this introduction, my goal is to give you a bit of an idea of what the most important commercial crops are from an acreage standpoint, and what some of the trends are in acreage. And then I'm also going to talk about some of the more unique factors of the crop, looking around the physiology and the pollination that is required for this crop. So when we look at pumpkin acreage stats for pumpkins and squash, you can see that it really has been steadily increasing over the past couple of decades. And that's largely due to a big increase in the home decoration for fall industry. We see that really start here in Ontario. We'll see sales ramp up after Labor Day, and many of our growers are exporting to the States, and because their children go back to school at the end of August, quite often the American buyers are looking to have pumpkins in their grocery stores for the final week of August, which means we start shipping harvested product usually around the 3rd week of August and continue right up until almost Halloween as far as that market goes. So steady increase in acreage has been good for our industry. The field cucumber acreage, however, has had a completely different story. It has seen, a big increase through the early 2000s, and then we started to see domestic product being replaced by imported product from India and China. We have seen a rebound as the industry changes. So we do have a good steady level at about 4,000 acres over the past decade. We've got a good steady level of pickles being produced in Ontario. Even though some of our major pickle producers have left the province, many of our growers are still shipping to pickle processing plants in the States through a green shipper or a middleman buyer. So we still have a solid industry for field cucumbers in Ontario. One of the unique things about cucurbit crops is that many of them have separate flowers for the male and the female. And you can tell that by the shape and qualities of the flower, the main thing being that the female flowers will have a small fruitlet at the base of the petals that you can see right here. And so that fruitlet develops as part of the mother plant. And when pollination occurs, it will drive seed production inside that fruit, which will cause the fruit to expand and become the marketable product that we want it to be, whether it's a pumpkin, as in the case of this flower, or a little watermelon or a little cucumber. They all look basically the same. And the female flower itself, you can see in here, it's got the stamen that will receive pollen in order to make that seed production happen. The ratio of males to females in the field, especially with pumpkins and squash, can be really quite enormous. There are 10 times as many male flowers as female flowers, and it can even be up to 100 males for every female, depending on the conditions. And the males are often much more noticeable because they sit higher up in the canopy. They're looking to attract those bees, whereas the female flowers sit lower in the canopy, which is good from a structural standpoint because they need to be close to the ground for the fruit to sit on as it develops. So when you're walking fields, don't worry if you're not seeing a lot of female flowers, because they're there. They're just hidden in the canopy. Depending on the variety, you're only looking at, for the larger pumpkin varieties, you're looking at 1 or 2 fruit per plant. And then as we get to the smaller varieties, the fruit set per plant will increase. But as long as the fruit set is there, the proportion of male flowers doesn't really make a difference. The different crop in this case are the pickling cucumbers, and growers will usually grow what they call a gynoecious variety. And that means that it's predominantly female. So those varieties will put out mainly female plants, and they'll be mixed in with another variety for the male plants or the male blossoms that provide the pollen that is required in order for the cucumbers to grow. So there's a picture of the male flower there. You can see the anther and you can see the pollen grains that have shed. And I call your attention to the slit at the base of the anthers there, and that leads to the nectaries. So that's where the nectar is produced that attracts the bees to come in. They put their siphoning mouth part into that nectary and basically suck out all of the nectar. And in doing so, they pick up a healthy amount of pollen, which they will then carry on with them when they go to the next flower and pollinate that flower. So for the melon and the cucumber crops, we do require supplemental bees in order for that to happen. We can't rely on native honeybee populations or naturalized honeybee populations to be substantial enough to conduct those pollination services. So most growers of these crops will be bringing in supplemental hives. For the pumpkins and squash, it's a slightly different story because we do have native pollinators that are specialized as pumpkin and squash pollinators. And in particular, the hoary squash bee, which is pictured here. Because pumpkins and squash are native to North America, the bees have co-evolved with pumpkins and squash. So they feed exclusively on pumpkin nectar and pollen, and they live within the crop canopy itself. And they are very effective pollinators because that is their preferred food source, which we compare to the honeybees, and cucurbit pollen is not one of their preferred food sources. So if there are other food sources in the area, they will actually fly over a pumpkin and squash field in order to find something that is more palatable to them and more nutritious for them. Whereas these native pollinators, this is what they do. Their sole purpose in life is to live off of pumpkin and squash pollen and nectar. I have a link here if you're interested in learning more about them. Here's a picture. You can see the bee, its head is deep into the flower, getting out that nectar, and you can see the legs are absolutely covered with pollen grains here. And then it flies onto the female blossom, needs to go in again for the nectar, losing pollen grains as it goes and completing that pollination that we want it to. They're a solitary ground nesting bee. So when you're scouting, you might even see these little nests on the edges of the field or within the field. And throughout southwestern Ontario, we have found that there are decent populations of these hoary squash bees in our pumpkin farms. So the hole itself is about the diameter of a pencil, and it goes quite deep. It goes about 18 inches into the ground. And the female bees will excavate this nest, and then they will create a cell deep in the ground. And in that cell, which is waterproof, the female will make a pollen ball of cucurbit pollen, and she will lay an egg on that pollen ball. She'll then seal off the nest and create another one and keep doing that until she's laid her entire brood. Those larvae will feed exclusively off the pollen ball. Then they will overwinter as mature larvae. They'll pupate in the spring and they will emerge just in time for the pumpkin flowering season. So their life cycle is completely aligned with the life cycle of the cucurbit crops as well. And there's a close-up of the squash bee, and compared to the honeybee, it is similar in size, but it looks, when you look at it, it looks quite different. It's got these very hairy legs. It's a much hairier insect, and that just means it picks up more pollen and does a more efficient job of pollinating those flowers. And there's a picture of the larvae feeding on the pollen ball, and you can see the cell in which I've pulled that out of when we excavated some of these nests a few years ago. So another different thing about cucumbers, which is a little bit newer in the marketplace, are the growing of these pathenocarpic varieties, or the growers often call them parth. And these are truly seedless. So they don't need to be pollinated in order to produce fruit. In fact, you don't want them to be pollinated. And you can see the difference here in the fruit. In this one on the left, you can see those seeds that are developing within that gel cavity of the seed cavity. Whereas in the second one, we still have the gel cavity, but there are no seeds inside that. And without having seeds actively growing, the fruit develops at a much slower rate, and that makes it a lot easier for growers to maintain a good small size over the course of the growing season, because they get a better premium price for the smaller cucumbers. And one of the challenges with traditional pickle production is that those cucumbers get oversized very quickly, and growers need to be in there every day, maybe even more than once a day, in order to maintain the quality that they get the premium for, the size quality that they get the premium for. So you can see in this picture here where we've got 4 different pickles growing on the vine, and they're all roughly the same size. In a traditional variety, you wouldn't see that. You'd have one that would be like a football sized, and then the others would be much smaller, because there's a dominance until you pick off the older ones, the younger ones don't come along. So here you're able to maximize your yields of a certain size category by growing these parthenocarpic varieties. They're also they lend themselves better to machine harvest. So you can go in there, harvest one time, and have better quality fruit as a result. And then we've also got the seedless watermelon, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And seedless watermelon is not truly seedless. So it still has these little modified seeds. It's actually a white seed coat. There's no seed inside it, so it's not viable. And you can eat it. It doesn't have, a lot of customers don't like to have seeds in their watermelon. And so these little seed coats are quite soft and hardly noticeable, depending on the year and the variety. So in order to get seedless watermelon, we need to do some creative things as far as planting goes. You need to have 2 different varieties. And so you're going to start with a seeded variety. Here they call it the male. So the seeded variety is contributing the pollen. And that variety has 4 sets of chromosomes. It's tetraploid. And then the seedless variety, here on this graphic, they called it a female. The seedless variety only has 2 sets of chromosomes. So when the pollen is transferred to the seedless variety, they cross, they end up with 6 chromosomes, which are divided in cell division, and then you end up with 3, which is an odd number, which results in a sterile seed. So it's not viable. It's those little white seed coats that don't make a big difference as far as the palatability. You don't have to spit out seeds while you're eating it. So that's how we get seedless watermelon. In order to do that in the field, it means that we have to plant 2 different varieties and keep track of them so that they're not being sold in the wrong category. So in this picture here, what growers traditionally did was they would have the seeded variety, and it would look quite a bit different than the seedless variety. In this case, the seedless variety is more rounded, and it's got a different stripy pattern to it. And the seeded variety is longer, more oblong, and just it looks quite different. So then when the workers go through the field, they're able to put those fruit in the correct bins so that you're not marketing them incorrectly. One of the challenges for growers with growing this way is that it's hard to market those seeded watermelon. The average consumer doesn't want them. And so they're having to plant 1/3 to 1/4 of their field to these pollinators, to the seeded ones that are providing the pollen for the seedless ones, but they're getting very little return on their investment. So something the seed companies did was that they developed these pollenizer varieties. And these pollenizer varieties, they're sold as a fruitless variety. That's not entirely true, because they do produce a fruit, but they produce these tiny little baseball-sized fruit. They're the pollen source for the seedless watermelon. but they don't take up a lot of space. They're not taking up a lot of nutrients. And instead of having to give 1/4 of your acreage to them, you're able to just interplant them in between two of the commercial plants. So you're getting more of the seedless watermelons per acre than you do in a traditional planting style. They're also really fun to throw. They explode on impact. Just make sure you don't hit anyone with them. So I just wanted to outline for your sake, so you have an idea of how quickly things move in the field and how long your scouting activities could continue. The average time from flower set to first harvest in pickling cucumbers, we're looking at 4 to 5 days, and that's a multi-pick harvest, so they will continue to harvest that field over several weeks before they fill that contract and move on to a later planted field. We do have machine harvest cucumbers in Ontario. It's not the bulk of our acreage, and they will be harvested a little bit later, but it's a once over destructive harvest. They just go in the field the one time. Slicing cucumbers, 15 to 18 days after the first flower set. Musk and watermelon, 40 days. Pumpkins and winter squash are 60 to 70 days. And then the summer squash is 3 to 8 days. The summer squash, the muskmelon, the watermelon, the slicing cucumbers, those are all multi-pick. So you're looking at several weeks of harvest. Whereas the pumpkins and the winter squash, it tends to be a once over harvest. The mature fruit can sit in the field for a period of time while everything ripens, and then growers go in and just harvest it one time. So as we go through the pest management side of these presentations, I've divided the pathogens into 3 different modules. The first one will be the mildews, the downy mildew and the powdery mildew. And despite having similar names, they're really quite different pathogens, and they impact different cucurbit vegetables. So those are probably the 2 most significant diseases that we deal with. So I go into them in quite a bit of detail, and it really is important that you know the biology and the identification of those 2 diseases. And then I go into the wilt diseases, and there's a number of those, and some of them are becoming of increasing importance in Ontario production. So I go into quite a bit of detail on those. And then we've got a fairly high number of different foliar diseases and fruit rots. These tend to be more sporadic. They don't occur every year, but it's still important to be able to identify when there's a problem and make sure that you're addressing it early, because many of these foliar diseases do result in fruit rots, which can be greatly impactful on the overall yield of the crop at the end of the season and its marketability. Once we're through the pathogens, I will be doing a module on the cucurbit insects, and there's really just the 4 main ones: cucumber beetles, aphids, spider mites, and squash bugs. So those are the modules that I will be continuing with through the IPM training. And I just call your attention to this chart here, which is particularly useful for the diseases, because we do have such a long list of diseases that are present in Ontario. We don't see them every year, and they don't impact each of the cucurbit crops equally. Some of them are prevalent in cucumbers, other ones are more of a problem in watermelon and cantaloupe. So it's good to know, based on the crop that you're scouting, which are the diseases that you're most likely to see. The overall scouting protocol for all diseases is going to be the same, and that is inspecting a minimum of 100 plants, 10 plants at each of 10 locations across the field. If the field is larger than 10 acres, you want to increase the number of plants that you're looking at up to as many as 200 plants, so 10 at 20 different locations across the field, and make sure that you're getting a good range of field conditions, from the low-lying areas to the high ground, sheltered areas, maybe from a fence row or windbreaks. Make sure that you're getting a good cross-section to have a good visual identification of anything that you might be seeing in the field. It's really important to always be looking at the upper and lower leaf surfaces, as well as the petioles, because different diseases appear at different spots on the plant. Know the periods of activity and the environmental conditions for each disease. We see different things in hot weather than we do in cooler weather. The impact of dew can be phenomenal, even in a hot, dry season. If we're getting heavy dews and long periods of leaf wetness through the day, that can really help propagate some of these diseases that you wouldn't expect to see because it's hot and dry. If you need to take samples, always store them in a bag and a cooler to preserve those symptoms. Symptom identification can be difficult, and a lot of the diseases look similar. So if you need help, your supervisor or feel free to give myself a call and send pictures, and I can help you with some of that identification. And if we're all really stuck, then we have the option to send things to the pest diagnostic clinic in Guelph to have them do a lab identification of the symptoms that we're seeing. So that is the introductory section. I will be carrying on in module 1 with the mildews, downy mildew and powdery mildew.